Martin, I was wondering if you could talk to us about what has changed over the last decade that has moved our thinking about personal data, about privacy, and how we see data as a potential harm rather than an opportunity.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think that the past 10 years have been incredible when it comes to the issue of digital rights. So 10 years ago, 2009, the first term of the Obama administration, we worked quite closely with that administration looking at digital technologies, open, free technologies as a tool to empower people, as a tool to liberate people. And then in early 2011 with the Arab Spring, people working on those issues felt, yes, you know, we're not only right, but history is with us. And this was an incredibly exciting time. And then you fast forward a few years later, and we realized belatedly that the degree to which the same technologies, and oftentimes with the same companies that we stood shoulder by shoulder with in the early 2010s, were also being used by authoritarian governments in order to surveil their citizens, in order to crack down on their human rights, their freedoms, and their liberties, and how non-state nefarious actors were also using those same tools. So we've come a very long way. Data has a collective impact. The use of data has a collective impact on our societies. And we need to have collective solutions, which I'm sure we'll talk about, in order to address these.
I think one other precipitating factor, being tech people, it's easy to really focus on the tech world, but I think we have to understand the broader context, which is that we've had a big concern about inequality, a big concern, big issues around populism, and the tech companies are 5 of the 6 largest companies in the world, and they have a business model driven by effectively surveillance of different forms, and the fruits of that are not being very equally distributed, and people are uncomfortable with the business model itself. At the same time, you have big concerns about AI, automation, what's that going to do to the future of work? And our data, this is something not everyone's aware of, are being used to train the automation systems and artificial intelligence systems that are fueling those concerns in the first place.
I was struck over the weekend with this Apple Card scandal. Some of you may have seen it, where someone in the US tried to apply for an Apple Card for himself and for his wife. And the 2 applicants were given different credit limits. And the woman applicant limit was lower. And when a complaint was made to the relevant companies, which I believe were both Apple and Goldman Sachs, and others might know better, the response came back was, that's the algorithm, we don't know there's nothing we can do about it. That's the algorithm's decision. The algorithm has ostensibly discriminated against the female applicant. How do we think about that in the context of privacy? That seems like an insufficient concept in order for us to grapple with questions around gender discrimination, but also how data is being used about us and to make inferences and decisions about us. Glen, do you have any thoughts on the insufficiency of privacy as a concept?
Well, I guess I wanted to first ask Jackie if she wanted to talk a little bit about what that framework is and the benefits that it has.
I'll come in on that, because I think that many of us in the room really don't understand what happens to our data. I certainly have had a bit of a enlightening experience in discovering that my data, which is my address, where I work, how I travel, which is picked up by Google most days because I use Waze to drive into the office, my health, is all fed into an algorithm. It's all available publicly somehow, or it can be extrapolated somehow by insurance companies. And if I go to a dentist in the UK, they will be able to offer me a loan to have all my teeth crowned if I so wished within 30 seconds. Because they have all the data there to feed into the system and decide whether I am a good credit risk. That is a very scary situation. And my question is, well, do I want to stop that? The European Court of Justice, which people don't think about as a human rights court, has really stated in the most absolute terms that the right to data protection is something which is of fundamental importance. And so the system that we have in the EU guarantees that there is a right to privacy, and the way that data is used now in the EU has as this big backdrop, this bright red light flashing if you're going to introduce a system which uses data, think about individual privacy.
But Martin, is the GDPR good enough? We were told that it was going to change things. It was going to be. We got all those emails in our inbox in May 2018, and interestingly enough, it was only a few weeks after Cambridge Analytica, so it was extraordinarily well timed. Some thought the EU had a role in that, but has it been enough to protect our rights?
Look, I think the GDPR is a great foundation. It should be preserved, and we should work collectively to ensure that it's implemented. Now, that being said, I also think that the GDPR is the ghost of data protection past, which is that it's rooted in the 95 Privacy Directive, which itself is rooted in what's called the OECD Consensus on Privacy in the 70s, which is basically focused on a very individualized notion of privacy. So as Jackie was saying, it's about my data, and it's about my relation as a data producer, data subject, with so-called data controllers. It's a very binary relationship. You can imagine me and my credit card data. Do I consent to my credit card data being used for X purposes? And the world we live in now is like that. You know, it's not a one-to-one world when it comes to data. It's a many-to-many world. It's not about just me and my credit card company. And it's also not just about me and my Nest thermostat and my IoT fridge. It's about that. But it's about the dependencies that data about me and data about other people make that impact my life.
Imagine that you consent to the use of your health data, either for a study or for some commercial purpose or whatever. That says things about your whole family because your conditions speak to the conditions of your family. Your family may now face different insurance premia based on a decision that you made. So there's very, very, very direct ways that aren't abstract at all, I think, in which it's not really coherent to think about privacy in a purely atomized, individualistic way.
And there's a great approach on this, I totally agree, looking about privacy dependencies, saying briefly like our privacy depends on three things: our social ties, so crime suspects that are apprehended based on DNA, the relatives of theirs unwittingly submitted to genealogical databases. So that's an example that's not just about me. Another one is the degree to it that is dependent on people I am deemed to be similar to. So if I share a flat with someone who gradually, I didn't know, becomes an opioid abuser, I am then deemed to be more likely myself to be an opioid abuser. So similarities. And the last one, which is even more potentially pernicious or interesting, depending on your perspective, is how I'm judged when it comes to differences, how different I am to the norm.
We do have to accept that there is immense possibilities in the data that we create, using that and generating insights from that. The health example, I think, is a good one. We know that there's an incredible opportunity to measure health in different ways and therefore design interventions in a way that minimizes the burden on the public health system by, well-being, focus on well-being and nudging healthy behaviors, all of this type of thing. If we go back to your first point, Glen, on the economics question here, how should we think about the value that's created from our personal data? Should we be thinking about the creation of data, and by that I mean even the passive leaking of data everywhere we go, as a form of labor, and should it be compensated? How do you approach that question?
Well, thanks, Carly. I love the way that you framed that question, because I think that far too often people like us are put in the position of just being party poopers. And there's this great data economy. We're just worried about ethics. And what ethics means is shutting things down. Yeah. That's not how I look at it at all. What I think is that if we want to have a productive society, we need to have a society that actually treats people like agents rather than like the passive participants in a surveillance state. And as such, I think one of the things that most came home to me is, I don't know if you saw this video that leaked out of Google a year or two ago, where they were sort of imagining your data as their customer rather than you as their customer. And they gave the example of, if we want to know your weight, rather than asking you your weight, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to use the data we have about you to figure out what scale would most appeal to you. What would you really love in a scale? And then we're going to, pay to place that higher up on the Amazon rankings. And then you're going to buy this scale, and it will have in the terms of conditions somewhere that, this data is reported back to Google. So what struck me about that example is not just that it's incredibly creepy and dishonest, which obviously it is, but from an economic perspective, it's a total waste. It's like, why invent some new scale and do all this analysis and manipulate some things when you could just ask someone the question? And I think so much of what's actually going on in our data economy is absurdly inefficient because we're spending all this time making inferences and manipulations and whatever, when if we were willing to compensate people and be honest with people and include them as agents in the process, it would both be much less creepy, but also much more efficient.
What is this world about? Are we at peace, or in fact, is there a war going on, and is it cyber warfare? And I think that's something which many of us do worry about, and that is really what is at risk for the rule of law, no matter whether you're talking about a very developed economy or whether you're talking about a small state which is beginning to set its own rules. It's really important to have controls there. And whether those controls are defined as individual or collective, provided they establish some guardrails for the use of data, I probably would say it doesn't matter what you call it, so long as you get the substance there. But all of us know that we're in a real crisis.
I worry about the implications of the finance being put into this. And I worry about the relation then between people who are deemed to have more or less valuable data. So to Glen's point, they'll be put into groups. And they're like the tyranny of the majority. And so if you were to set up such a construct and then have a majority interest that has greater, more valuable data, which would impose their view over people, part of groups with sort of less valuable data, I think it's problematic. We already live in a world where powerful actors in our societies have a disproportionate role when it comes to governance, when it comes to politics and power. We've seen facial eye recognition algorithms that are incapable of recognizing black faces because they're trained on solidly white individuals and solidly white males. So these issues of certain groups in society that are deemed more powerful taking over, I think, is a really worrying one, and one which I think that collective rights over data are an answer to. But the financial motive here, and again, this notion of sort of more or less valuable data, I think is worrying. And then the last point is, I think, even if we crack that, I think it's an OECD solution.
In some ways, the developing world is a problem. In other ways, it's an opportunity, precisely because a lot of the surveillance systems that we're talking about have not penetrated as deeply in that context, and yet there is an emergence of a sort of more bottom-up cell phone infrastructure and so forth, and the possibility of building into that different ways of conceptualizing of interconnection.
To the extent that there are privacy rights and protections, if people don't exercise them, are they still entitled to that protection? And we see, for example, cookie notices everywhere across European websites, and I think probably lots of us ignore those. Does that change how we are entitled to claim rights to privacy?
The court has said that when an individual accesses a website, there has to be an active consent by that individual to the use of cookies. And that individual has not to have a pre-ticked box that they just kind of pass through. They have to actively say, yes, I'm going to choose between the types of cookies that I want to accept, whether they're just those essential to make this website work, or whether they are, they provide for information to be transmitted to third parties, in which case that information is going to be described to you, you understand where it's going, and you understand how long that will happen for. That's a huge change, and I think it's very, very valuable, and I think that's something which, if you want to replicate a rule, that seems to me like a good rule to replicate. We can now say, okay, so we'll not accept the cookies. Oh, damn it, can't get into that website. I've lost out. I may say, oh, I don't want to be on Facebook because I don't know what's going to happen to my data. Well, I miss out on the contact with people that I've known for years, all of whom, are organizing a reunion and they wouldn't think about sending an email to invite you, so you missed that invitation. I've personally missed out. There's this, I think, issue for everyone at the moment, which is maybe you are beginning through education to understand that data has a value, that sometimes your data is used in ways which you didn't understand and you may not want that to happen. But if you opt out for all of that, you're losing out. And is that really what we're trying to achieve? Surely not.
When you think of, the right to sort of clean water, safe water and sanitation for your kids, for us, we're not then given like a little pipette, and every time you open the tap, to drink some water, you need to sort of check, have I actively consented? I need you to check. The responsibility isn't put entirely on us. I think the current framework, all of the responsibility is on me. I actively consent. There's my responsibility. So,
But if the current framework were enforced adequately, the responsibility and accountability would transmit. And so I think that plays a role. I agree with you that this is not a perfect regime, but if you have to start somewhere.
Glen, could you talk a bit also about what's happening in the US around regulation? So GDPR is a European-based law. Obviously it touches on the American companies, but we don't have any equivalent comprehensive data protection law in the US at the moment.
Yeah.
Is there movement that we should know about there? And do you think that might change the situation?
Well, I think the fascinating thing is actually in some ways the dynamic between the US and Europe, because on the one hand, California passed the CCPA, which is basically, with some slight differences that I think frankly are eventually going to be ironed out in how it's enforced, more or less a copycat of the GDPR. And once you pass something in California, especially given both its size as a state and the location of many of the relevant entities within California, I think as a practical matter, that's going to end up mostly propagating to the United States within some period of time. At the same time, for better or worse, given our individualistic, capitalistic orientation in the United States, there is a real focus on the economic side of this stuff, and that's moving much more ahead. The governor in California talked about that. The Colorado State Legislature is talking about that. The U.S. federal government is talking about that. And there are many problems with that, as Martin was raising, and I agree with many of his concerns. However, I think the dialogue between this sort of rights-based approach and a focus on economics, especially as it gets internationally harmonized, which it's going to have to do, the companies are going to need that. The public is going to demand that. There's going to be international trade disputes around it. I think it's going to come to, hopefully, a good point, which is to emphasize the combination of the collective national perspective, the need to think about the economic side of it, and the importance of protection of rights. And some fusion of those can hopefully bring us to a workable set of standards that balances these different issues.
Do we see a trend where countries outside of Europe and outside of the US are adopting GDPR-style laws, or is there a growth of data protection outside of these major economies?
Yes, I think that's a simple answer. As you were saying, we expected the world to change in one sense when the GDPR was adopted. I don't know how many people in this room use the term GDPR and it trips off the tongue, but I do know that when the GDPR came into force in May 2018, there were more searches in Google for GDPR than there were for Beyonce. So it did make its mark.